Welcome to Policy and Advocacy in Action, a channel of NRCDV Radio. Today, you'll be hearing from Heidi Notario, our Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Systems Change, as she discusses the role of faith and spirituality in the context of gender-based violence, with Sally MacNichol and Quentin Walcott, co-executive directors of Connect New York. Connect New York is an organization that works with New York City communities to prevent intimate partner violence and promote gender justice. Much of the work of this organization happens with faith-based leaders and their communities. Let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today as we begin some of our conversations around the topic of faith, spirituality, and intimate partner violence. So with me today, I have two guests from Connect New York, and I will have them introduce themselves in a second. Just to let the listeners know that Connect New York is an organization that's based in the city, and they do tremendous amount of work with the community and through the lens of faith. So I have with me today the two co-directors of Connect New York. So I will turn it over to you both now. Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Well, my name is Sally MacNichol from Connect New York, and I'm here with Quentin Walcott, co-executive director. And we'll just tell you a little bit about Connect and how we got into the faith work in the early 2000s, right before 2001. Connect came into being, and we came into being asking the questions of what the communities needed in terms of domestic violence. We had a lot of resources in terms of criminal justice remedies and shelters, or those had grown, but as we all know, that things hadn't really changed that much. So we went into communities in New York City and did research on the ground and asked questions about what people thought about domestic violence and child abuse. And we found, it was a long process. We talked to about 500 people altogether.
Yeah.
And, but, before we go on, why don't you introduce yourself? I just jumped in, so sorry.
Thanks for having us. My name is Quentin Walcott, also known as Q, and I'm the co-executive director of Connect, along with Sally. And I think just to kind of fill in where Sally was just mentioning, when we did this research, it was really, when Sally says on the ground, it was really on the street level, going where people were in communities. And that was like laundromats, train stations, supermarkets, and we started doing our work in one section of New York City, which was Flatbush, East Flatbush, and Crown Heights. So the backdrop of what was happening in the city at that time, where that was the highest incidence of domestic violence that were reported were happening in that section of Brooklyn. And also, what was also happening there was, really poor community relationships, police brutality. There was issues around HIV and AIDS with young girls. There's also, issues around men coming home from incarceration back into Brooklyn. So it was multiple issues happening in the city at that time, along with domestic violence. And our approach was to really kind of see how domestic violence was connected to all of those things. So we asked, when we did our research, we stood in front of, in the community, we spoke to women, we spoke to men, we spoke to youth, we spoke to community-based organizations, grassroots organizations that are, dealing with domestic violence directly or indirectly, but primarily indirectly, and maybe seeing more domestic violence than we do as a domestic violence organization at that time.
Yeah, and so one of our findings, we when we asked people where they wanted to go to get help, one of our findings was that they wanted to go to their faith community. And there are lots of reasons for that we know. I mean, people feel comfortable in their faith communities, especially when the outside world is not so hospitable to them. When they're newly arrived in this country, that's where they can get a sense of belonging. People can feel at home in their faith community. So that made a lot of sense. But we also found out that often the response wasn't exactly what people needed. So we went on from there.
And this was right directly after 9/11. So communities were being surveilled based on their religious beliefs. In this part of Brooklyn, and we later became a citywide organization doing the same research in other parts of the city. But, folks are really struggling with this idea of being deported, not having a place to go to that they felt safe if they were victims of domestic violence, because there was also an added pressure to the type of violence and the power and control that can be leveraged based on the fact that you are undocumented in this country. So that was another level of abuse that survivors and families were experiencing.
So we went on from there to try to develop and have developed relationships with different faith communities. Different survivors of faith came to us. Different faith communities decided that they wanted to delve deeper into ways that they could help survivors and help prevent domestic violence. And since that time, we've developed a faith program where we tailor each, we respond to what the community needs. And each faith community is different, and probably one of the biggest mistakes that advocates can sometimes make, and all of us can sometimes make, is having general assumptions about different faith traditions and thinking that, they're all, all Christians are the same, or all Muslims are the same. So when you approach survivors, you just have some ideas that are not complex and not open and questioning. So we tailor our work with every faith community based on what their resources are, what they think is the best way to approach the problem of violence in their community.
Right. And I would say that in terms of the work that we do at Connect, and we really apply, particularly in the beginning when we first started, applied community organizing approaches to this work around domestic violence and gender-based violence. And, from my experience growing up with family members that were really leaders in their faith communities, that people of faith are really great organizers. And so we really wanted to tap into that ability that existed for, community organizations, particularly faith communities that organize in their communities. They addressed not only the religious, theological issues, but also the issues that were happening in that community. And one of the things that we recognized when approaching this work from a domestic violence, gender-based violence lens with faith communities is where they kind of their histories around organizing around social justice or health issues. And for me, one of the things that I noticed that the faith community did not do well was in organizing around, the HIV and AIDS epidemic. So we use that information as a starting point for some faith organizations that really didn't do well in that. But now, because of the fears around, homophobia and, what it meant to admit that somebody in that congregation was dealing with that. So we use that as a foundational piece to, so how do we introduce this issue of domestic violence, which is also a very personal issue, but has a very public implication to it, and that where can the faith community approach this issue better. And in some cases, we found out that some of the faith institutions we worked with try to couple all the issues together as a strategy to deal with HIV and AIDS, domestic violence, re-entry into communities. So some churches are trying to deal with so many issues, not to specifically target, domestic violence or HIV or whatever it may be.
I mean, I think also understanding domestic violence as a social justice issue is a critical part of how we frame the issue. And very often, people in general and in faith communities, it's looked at as as Q said, it's a very private issue. And it's looked at more as an individual pathology, even a family pathology, sometimes, a community pathology that's separated from other communities. But so to reframe it around social justice was actually a challenge, and actually was a bigger challenge with folks that named themselves social justice churches or mosques or synagogues, and so that was challenging. Oftentimes, we don't see the connections, the interconnections, the ways that oppressions are interlocking, the ways that when you're talking about, for instance, reentry, there are always issues around intimate violence there that need to be addressed, but they're often dropped out. They're around prison reform or prison abolition or gun and gang violence. So that's one of our strategies too, is to get the social justice issues that people do care about to inform around how domestic violence is a critical part of that issue. And if that's your faith mandate and you feel strongly that you have to address that issue, you try to make those connections.
Yeah, and we're called Connect, and it's a pun. It's people think it's an acronym, but it's really actually connecting people, connecting communities, and connecting issues, and making sure that people understand. Just like in a faith context, when we talk about reentry, the reason why someone was incarcerated, if you dig a little bit deeper, if it wasn't the primary reason why someone was arrested, if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find that there's some form of domestic violence connected to that. HIV and AIDS, for instance, people being infected can be a reason based on domestic violence, someone forcing you to shoot drugs or to have sex, unprotected sex, all these different things that we really made deeper connections for people, and even around health issues. A survivor experiencing domestic violence is impacted in health because of the violence that they receive in terms of how their body responds to trauma, and also can lead to issues if things are unresolved, depression and trauma, to mental health issues. So we really made a lot of these deep connections with people and made it this private thing, seemingly so private thing, more palatable, because we showed how it shows up in everyday life. And children who witness violence in the home, that showed up in Bible study, where Bible teachers would notice that how the children that were in the class were impacted by what they said or how they behaved. So there's many ways that we approach this subject with faith communities to make it seem like this is not so private or so taboo, that it's really common and a lot of people are dealing with this all the time.
Yeah, I think that's actually just getting folks to know that it's, for instance, the Pew Forum has a statistic that 1 in 3 people in the pews, and that's in the Christian context, are affected by domestic violence. So oftentimes faith communities, because that's a place where good people are, feel, no, it's not happening here. And of course it's a secret that it is happening there. So it's just making it a space for people to be able to feel free to come forward is a starting point, getting people to acknowledge and see what's going on.
Right. So the one of the main pieces with churches and faith communities was to make them understand that people, particularly if you're undocumented from another country, come to the United States, New York City in particular, and wanted to have a place of sanctuary, a place where to go. So we wanted to kind of create a space where survivors could come forward, get the help that they need without being blamed for the abuse that they were receiving. So this is some of the backdrop of what we understood to be what the community wanted, what were some of the pitfalls in disclosing in faith communities. So we wanted to address that and connect faith communities with domestic violence organizations and partnerships and really build their capacity to address survivors' needs.
That's great. I think you both have touched on a number of things here, super important, and I'm really, I was really moved by your connections between community organizing and the role of the church or the faith community in general. Also utilizing some of the community organizing tools, if you will. So I think that's very interesting. In general, based on your experience, are there any questions that survivors commonly ask related to their faith?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I mean, I think that when violence is happening to survivors and they're people of faith, that those are primary questions. The questions of why is this happening to me? Have I done something wrong to make this happen to me? God is not hearing my prayers. Am I going to be forgiven? So there's a lot of shame and guilt, and there's a lot of questioning. There's a sense of, has God abandoned me? Sort of a ricocheting back and forth between, has God abandoned me? Am I being punished? What have I done to deserve this? So it's a very deep and painful for people of faith. It's a violation, a betrayal of a sense of meaning, very often.
Yeah, and I think there's so many mixed messages that we get from the Bible, from our families who are kind of entrenched in faith tradition about, burden and sacrifice. Or are survivors doing something wrong by talking about what is happening? Is it part of that burden and sacrifice? Are they, and we give these ideas that, women in particular are built a certain way. They're supposed to be able to endure a lot of men's attitudes, belief systems, and behavior. And if they feel that there's something wrong with this and that they're complaining, or even if the bigger question is the big D word, and that's not domestic violence, it's divorce.
Yeah,
am I duly sworn to stay in this relationship even though I'm being abused?
I've made a vow.
Right, made this vow, and that's where spiritual abuse, this idea of what spiritual abuse is. One example of it is misinterpreting the Bible and how relationships are kind of laid out in the Bible, can be manipulated, and that can be the form of abuse to kind of keep someone in a relationship or make them feel like they're doing something wrong and that's the reason why they're being harmed. Mm-hmm. So many questions.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Painful.
So in your work, working with different faith communities, what role do you think faith leaders can play in providing leadership on this issue of ending violence?
Really important, critical role. Faith leaders have a critical role. Of course, they have a moral voice and a powerful way to influence the community. So, I mean, for one thing, faith leaders can take this issue on first by looking at themselves and doing some, self-awareness, self-review of their own experiences of domestic violence. And, I think one thing that you could say is that, people who go into helping professions, and being a faith leader is very much a helping profession, often have, their own traumas and their own wounds. And so, first of all, it's important that faith leaders really look at those experiences around domestic violence and the way they've been shaped by their theological understandings and their understandings of sacred scripture, and so that's important. But then faith leaders can preach about domestic violence, preach about mutuality, about equality, about partnership, about healthy relationships, and also not just keep it in the faith leaders, you know, in the power there. The power has to be analyzed, how power is organized in a faith community, and just to open up the conversation, to make sure that people feel unafraid to come forward and won't be judged. And so it's important that faith leaders get a lot of education and partner with domestic violence programs, understand, you know, keep in contact with the resources around them, so when someone does come to them, that they don't just take it on themselves, because sometimes faith leaders have a sense of like, I'm going to fix this, and this is something that we will handle inside here. But faith leaders really need to partner with people in the community that do this work.
Right. I think that's so critical, that last piece Sally mentioned, to realize you're not all-knowing. You're not going to master this issue because you don't have the background in it, or so. And when you profess to be all-knowing and I'll take care of this and I'll handle it, it recreates the system and the dependency that survivors may have on a system or a person to get them out of that situation. So it's very important that, just to be honest, that I'm not a professional in this, but I do have some resources I can connect you to. I think one of the other things that faith leaders can do is to really interpret text in a real objective way, so it kind of counters a narrative that a survivor believes to be the interpretation, or also the person who's being abusive in a relationship can use that text to justify or rationalize the harm that they're doing in a relationship. Because there's always that piece of, you know, Sally and I have run battles groups together and worked with abusive partners or people that do harm, better term for it. And they've used this idea that what the Bible says, or what this stanza says, and interprets it to be, I can do this to my wife, I can do this to my children. When in actuality, if you read the full passage or the next passage, it really explains away this idea that you are not to control your wife or your partner in a way. You have to really kind of demonstrate and model this relationship that you have with God, in a way that does not exemplify power or abuse. So I think that piece is really important, to kind of really interpret in a way, and then also recognize where they land in that. You know, we've done work in many faith communities, and the pastor or the deacons or someone has been connected to the cycle of violence in some way, either being a child witness to it, you know, seeing their parents do harm to each other, or abusive partner doing harm to their mother per se, or a sister, just seeing the harm that can be done, and just really recognizing that this is an issue. We can't mask it in through faith and through text in a way that's not helping people. And then the whole idea around, you know, socialization. A lot of our socialization comes from who we see biblical figures are, and how men are, and how women are in a faith context. So to really be honest and open about that, and breaking that down, about what are the images that people are seeing, what are the words that are being used to describe text, and then, you know, putting all that together to really kind of break down what is healthy, what is unhealthy, what is acceptable in terms of relationships, and using the tool of faith or the book of faith as a way of breaking that down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a long-term process. It's not just getting a training and, you know, having a telephone number, because there you know, as Q said, issues around the interpretation of sacred text. But what does accountability mean in the church, and how do you understand marriage? And one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of faith leaders make is that they try to go for couples counseling. And as we know, in the situation of domestic violence, that's the last thing that should happen. And so that's probably in every training and workshop we do, that's the main thing we want people to walk away with, the idea that do not call the person who's abusing up and tell them to come to meet with you and the person who's being abused and try to, work something out. And we don't want to sacrifice people's lives for the idea of having a family and marriage work out. And that is really an impulse that happens. And just to understand what accountability is and to believe the person who's being victimized. Very often there's that same tendency that the whole society has, not only to deny, but to rationalize or justify or minimize what's going on. And it's just, I think after significant training, people do get the idea like, okay, I can't do that. I have to listen, and not make assumptions about what I want to have happen.
Right, and I think in Sally and I, from just doing co-facilitating trainings together with faith and clergy leaders and faith communities, we've got so many examples and stories of that, And I think just to underscore what Sally mentioned about like this idea of couples counseling, like we could be on this podcast and Sally and I in an abusive relationship, and you ask us a question, Sally, is Q harming you in any way? And I'm sitting right next to her, looking at her, staring at her, threatening her in some way, and not going to get to a genuine answer, right? And if she does say that, and you as the facilitator or the faith leader does not know what to do with that information, you can really exacerbate the violence once the people leave out of that room. So it's important to really be honest about what it is, what are the techniques, and discern. That you have to really figure out, is there a power control dynamic here? How does that manifest itself? And as men who are helpers in the work around domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it's important for us, I think, to even do even more deeper work. As Sally and I always mention, that there's more work that needs to be done with men than there is survivors, because this choice to be abusive or this rationalization to be abusive is very different from the choice to the prohibiting and limited choices that survivors have to, just leave a abusive relationship. So I think it's important that, faith leaders, particularly those that are male, can really discern what's happening and see through the same socialization that we've received as men from each other when it's in front of us. So I think that critical thinking or that analysis of family dynamics, relationship dynamics, and just how power works, I think is important to be able to recognize, and they could do that. And then the work that Sally and I do with faith communities is not just working with the victim survivor and getting them the respite and help and care and safety that they need. It's changing the culture of the faith community. So it's not just the pastor and the leader. They play a role. Attitude is a reflection of that leadership that they give, but also the rumor mills that are connected to churches. If there's a lack of a policy or protocol when there's a domestic violence situation in that church, things could go very, very wrong very quickly. And if the pastor's not preaching about it, along with the protocol, along with the services that are available within the church or connected to a community-based organization, all those things kind of need to be in place. And they play a role in making that happen.
This is such an important topic, and I want to thank both of you for such wonderful information and so many tips. And I think I want to extend an invitation to continue talking about this topic. As we all learned, 30 minutes is really not enough. So this was just the beginning of our collaboration here between Connect New York and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So again, thank you both for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll do this again.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Policy and Advocacy in Action, an NRCDV radio podcast production. To learn more about Connect New York, visit connectnyc.org. To hear more NRCDV podcasts and to access additional resources, visit nrcdv.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at NRCDV. Policy and Advocacy in Action is an NRCDV radio podcast production brought to you by the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Support is provided by the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and did not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.